Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Lis Valle-Ruiz. I teach worship and preaching at McCormick Theological Seminary. And in this video, I am responding to Jared Alcantara's chapter, Preach Convictionally, in his book, The Practices of Christian Preaching. And this short essay is about let your life preach while you are preaching. Let your life preach while you are preaching. In his essay, Alcantara defines conviction as a commitment to a cause greater than oneself for the sake of a mission greater than one's life. And I want us to think about how can that impact the very practice of preaching that we are using. In his essay, Jared Alcantara, talks about especially Paul and how what he believes and how he lives his life work together, right? This is a common topic in preaching, a common topic in preaching on how the way we live our lives impact our preaching and how we are believable or not, right? Our witness, our example matters to God and to our congregation. Alcantara quotes a person who said that 75 of our sermon is the life that we live. And he talks about performance-based obsession with outcomes. Tells us that preaching is not about success, but about faithfulness and fruitfulness, and that we should let the outcomes to God, which is very reformed of Alcantara, should I say. And he emphasizes holiness, right? Gives us some practices that we need to follow so we can preach convictionally. He gives a lot of examples of people whose lives demonstrated that they were committed to a cause greater than themselves, and they were willing to put their lives on the line for that cause. And that made a great impact on how they preached. And that is powerful. That made for powerful preaching. In this essay, I want to expand that conversation to bring that conviction back to the very practice of preaching. We are typically used to thinking of preaching as a person standing up behind a pulpit in front of a congregation during a worship service. And that is not the only preaching practice that exists. And as a matter of fact, it's not the preaching practice of Paul, and it was not the preaching practice of Jesus, because there were not church buildings when they were around. I mean, preaching didn't happen inside of the temple when they were around. And I want us to think about the different preaching practices that they had. I also want us to think about specifically when Paul preached in Athens, because we may be extrapolating that preaching practice to all his preaching, and that might not be fair, but I'm going to focus on that one because that is the one that most resembles the normative preaching practice that we have today. So when he was in Athens, in the Areopagus, Paul used what we know today as classic rhetoric, Greco-Roman oratory. And he was probably standing, it was a big rock, and he was probably standing with his interlocutors. And they actually were probably having a conversation. It was a debate more than a presentation, that the way we are used to think of preaching today. But still, we imagine that he was speaking to them because we have this little speech, right, recorded in scripture that he said to them, which was only the presentation of the argument before the debate began, right? Like in a debate, a person presents an argument and then there's somebody else that presents a counter argument or rebuts, and then the person who presented the argument in the first place can defend their argument. And we have some of that. Actually, we have the whole thing recorded, but we only focus on the first part of the speech because we are reading it from our normative practice today. Now, let's take, for example, how we imagine Jesus is preaching. That's a very different image we have in our minds. We typically imagine it as Jesus sitting down with his disciples around. The recordings we have in scripture have him telling stories, asking questions, quoting sayings of proverbs, popular wisdom. That's the kind of recordings we have in scripture. So they have different kinds of rhetorical devices, but they also use their bodies differently. So right now I'm using performance differently than Alcantara used performance in his essay. In his essay, he talked about performance-based obsession with outcomes. And he stressed the importance to not focus on success, but on faithfulness and fruitfulness, and let the outcomes to God, right? And he was talking about performance in the sense of the way that we do our job. That's kind of performance. But I'm talking about performance in the way we use our bodies, that kind of performance. So the performance of Paul in the Areopagus was as a narrator. He stood up, he spoke. Jesus maybe sat down, he told stories, he asked questions. Paul was acting as a narrator, Jesus was acting as a teacher. It's a different kind of performance. And these are not the only two preaching practices that we have recorded in scripture or in the Christian tradition. In scripture, we can find the practices of the Hebrew prophets, such as Isaiah, who use symbolic action. For example, he walked around naked for 3 years because God told him to do so. We have the practice of symbolic action that Jeremiah used when he put on his neck a yoke because it had a symbolic meaning that he used. So he used a symbolic action and a symbolic object to demonstrate his sermon. And today we use that only for children, but he wasn't preaching to children, he was preaching to his peers. And in the Christian tradition, we have the early church. Preaching didn't happen in church buildings. It happened in house churches. It happened outdoors. It happened eventually in catacombs, synagogues, and houses. So the dynamics of that preaching were very different. And so the performance had to be different because the distance between the preacher and the audience was different. But then the church went empire. So an emperor allegedly converted to Christianity, legalized Christianity, and now we have these big church buildings, these temples, and then the distance between the preacher and the audience becomes greater. We had a big congregation and an expert explaining scripture from far away. And we might imagine that they were standing up from a pulpit high above, which at some point they did later on, but in the fourth century, maybe not yet. For sure, bishops didn't, because bishops were sitting down, right? That's the word cathedral means where the chair is, because the bishop, that's where the seat of the bishop was, right? So we can imagine St. Augustine, for example, who used to preach every day at some point. He was sitting when he was preaching, and his audience was standing because there were no pews at some point. And there were preachers who would preach truth to power, in which we have paintings that may be more the product of the imagination of the artist, but they may say something about some historical practices in which the preacher is standing up while the king is sitting down. And the preacher is in a lower position in relationship to the audience, which is the king, which is at a higher position. So The performances are different depending on who is the preacher and who is the audience and where they are located. And so I want us to think about where our preaching practices happen. But more than that, I want us to think where they should happen, depending on what is that cause greater than oneself that we have chosen and that we are willing to give our lives for. And we have other options other than standing behind a pulpit and talking down to a congregation if we want to create a different world. And that is the thing, that the performance that we choose, and we may think, but that's how we preach. That's what preaching is, standing behind a pulpit and talking. But it makes a difference in the kind of world that we create. When we stand behind a pulpit and talk down, and I'm not talking about your attitude, I'm talking about the very positionality of the bodies. If the pulpit is in a higher position in reference to the congregation is sitting down looking up to you physically. You are creating a world. We are helping to recreate a world of hierarchies in which the authority of the preacher is above the congregation. And there are options for that. There is the possibility of taking, as a matter of fact, we have already taken the pulpit down. Once upon a time, architecturally, these big churches used to have the pulpit very high up. Now, there were reasons also to help with the sound for this before we had all this like technology to help with the sound. So that the pulpit was high up and then it was taken down. And some churches have yeah, they don't call it pulpit, um, but one space for the leader of the worship service and one space for the preacher. And some churches have combined that. And some churches keep that one in the side, or some churches have put it that one in the middle. And those things have meaning, right? That means that is the equal value of the leader and of the preacher. That could mean that, depending on the congregation and the theology of the denomination and all of those things. But in our tradition, right, we say that we believe in that we are all ministers, right? So we shouldn't be recreating these hierarchies of this ministry is more valuable than the other. So we should be using the only one pulpit and maybe in the middle, in the side, doesn't matter, but equal value. And maybe we can take it down and don't have it in a higher position, but have it in the same level than the congregation. Now, there are reasons for visual purposes, but now the mega churches, the big churches, have solved that the way that the ancient churches solved that. So the congregation is in like a hill, kind of going down, and then the things that we want to see are lower, and that actually helps acoustically with the sound. And that's probably how Jesus preached, right? At the bottom of the hill, so then the sound would go up, and people maybe were sitting on the hill when he was talking, if they were many. And when he was with his disciple, maybe he was just sitting among them asking questions because he was the teacher. So, depending on the size of the church, you select your preaching practice. Now, some options that we have. We have the Gospel of Solentinami. This is a practice that Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua did with his congregation, in which they interpreted scripture together. The wisdom of their embodied lived experience, all of them, not just the preacher, but all of the congregation, helped interpret scripture for them at the moment, made the word come alive again. So they co-preached the congregation together. And their sermons published in a series of books that you can find called like that. The books are called The Gospel in Solentiname. And the author is, or the editor, Ernesto Cardenal. And he himself might think that those were not sermons. I think they were, in the same way that Jesus' sermons were sermons. And that's a different kind of preaching practice, one that creates a different kind of world, a more flat world, right? There's the possibility of preaching in the round. And here we have proposals by John McClure. He proposes the round table pulpit, and where the leadership together prepares sermons. Now, in his proposal, the pastor is the one delivering the sermon, but I would take that all the way to delivery and say, well, why do we have to stop at the preparation stage? We can actually deliver the sermon in community. And if the congregation is too big to do that, like I think I'm inferring here that in Solentiname, the congregation was small enough to do it all together. But if the congregation is too big to do that, there's always the fishbowl technique, and then a group of people can do it for the whole congregation to watch. And then those who are in the fish bowl can take turns, right? Which is part of the proposal that John McClure makes in the roundtable pulpit. There's the early church practice of dinner church, based on house churches. And it's coming back again, and taking track, where the worship service happens around a table, and they're having a meal like it was used to be done. It was not ritualized the ways we do it in community. It was actually a meal, like a potluck. So the sermon happens during the potluck. People are eating and discussing the the scripture. And there you can do simple things that don't have to be so radical like the ones I've been talking about. You can just preach from downstairs. You can just change the seating arrangements. And maybe you have done some of these things already. So, my question to you, my challenge to you right now is, what preaching practices best align with your convictions? If you are going to preach convictionally, what preaching practices best align to your convictions so you can create in the world the kind of world that best represents that philosophy and that values that you are committed to, that you are willing to give your life for, that you feel called by God to live for. So let your life preach while you are preaching. It's not only about the alignment between the performance of your whole life and what you say while you're preaching, but also the alignment of your performance while you are preaching. Let your life preach while you are preaching. So help us, God.